The Axeman of New Orleans is the nickname given to a person, a serial killer, operating in the New Orleans and surrounding communities in the early 1900s. In most of the victims' cases, the killer entered the home by removing a panel on the door with a chisel that they then left near the door. There were also never signs of robbery because nothing of value was taken from any of the houses. There were also not any physical sexual attacks, so the only weapon the killer ever actually brought onto the scene was a straight razor. Throats slashed, heads bashed in, and nearly decapitated were just some of the descriptions used in the police reports. The Axeman would make a bloody mess and then disappear. There are many discrepancies on when the attacks started. Some say they started with the Maggio couple's death in May 1918 and ended with the murder of Mr. Pepitone in October of 1919, and then he disappeared. Former Detective D'Antonio, along with many others, believe the killer began in 1910 to 1912 and disappeared for 6 years until the Maggio murders in 1918. The Axeman of New Orleans has never been apprehended, and his identity remains a mystery to this day. There are, however, many theories about who the Axeman was and why he murdered.
Hi, welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve. This podcast is about true crime, disappearances, hauntings, and anything strange or unusual. I also drink a whole bunch of Diet Coke and pronounce most things wrong. If you would like to support my Coke habit, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Please check out my YouTube page and email me any stories at truecrimeandcoke@gmail.com. So, let's get started.
Let's start with theories. One was that there were so many Italian immigrants attacked that people assumed that it was a hate crime of some sort or a group of hate crimes. They also threw out that there was probably no Axeman, but instead several people that were inspired by the Axeman attacks and decided to do it themselves. As I said in part 1, many Sicilian immigrants at that time had a deep distrust of the authorities, which led them to take disputes into their own hands and settle them the old-fashioned way, known as the vendetta. The vendetta could well have been the reason behind a number of the attacks. This has led some to believe that they were all victims of an early form of mafia called the Black Hand. Black Hand crime was a name given to an extortion method used in Italian neighborhoods at this time. Therefore, the murders could be linked to unpaid extortion debts. However, the Axeman frequently left suspects alive, which many mafia experts believe would not have been the case if they'd have been true Black Hand attacks. Shouldn't they have been called Italian hand attacks versus Black Hand attacks? Many of the victims who operated grocery stores reported to the local press that they received threatening letters not long before they received a murderous nighttime visitor. Although there was undoubtedly a vendetta culture in some parts of the Italian community and such killings were not uncommon, they were, however, usually efficient and clean. Most Italian gangs would have never used an axe to attack their targets, yet alone leave a handful of them alive to tell the tale. In addition, the Italian gangs had an unspoken honor code whereby it was very rare for women and children to be attacked as part of a vendetta. That was when crime had class. The Axeman did not care about the gender or age of his victims, killing indiscriminately in a way the Italian gangs would not have done. The multiple media outlets sensationalized the mafia viewpoint to the point that after more attacks came that year in 1919, the crimes were further sensationalized by the publication in the Times-Picayune of a letter that was supposedly written by the killer, but this was considered in some circles to be a hoax, perhaps perpetrated by the newspapers itself to sell more papers. Some crime analysts have proposed that the motivation for the crimes was sexual and that the slayer was potentially a sadist, and the pattern suggests they were seeking exclusively female targets. Some criminologists have hypothesized that the Axeman murdered male victims solely when they hindered his efforts to reach his preferred target of women. So, as I said before, there were no physically sexual attacks. Attacks can still be sexual without being physical. He could still get off on murdering and stuff, so it's possible. Another theory is that there were many copycat killers. Although the Axeman had a very distinct MO, not all of the killings followed it to the T, leading some to believe the Axeman was, in fact, several people who may or may not have been working together to terrorize the community. There is also a supernatural theory that the killer was, in fact, an ungodly demon from hell. His ability to appear in people's houses in the middle of the night and vanish just as easily had some believing, and still do believe, that the Axeman was indeed what he said he was in his letter to the press, the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. There are people who believe that he could shrink down to fit through small spaces, like the chiseled doorways, and then grow into the big man that the witnesses saw. People cannot believe that a mere mortal could fit into chiseled out portions of the door. So some of them even thought they were midgets. But those people fail to remember that after chiseling through a panel, the killer would reach his hand up and unlock the door on the inside, allowing himself in. Another theory suggests that the Axeman perpetrated the crimes in a bizarre effort to make jazz music more popular. This conjecture is due to the note allegedly written by the Axeman, in which he proclaims that he will not slaughter anyone who plays jazz in their home. The first jazz recording, in 1917, was led by an Italian-American named Nick LaRocca, and there's a theory that maybe the Axeman was getting revenge against Italian-Americans, the majority of his victims, because black jazz musicians weren't getting their due credit. The letter is thought to have been written by a composer named Joseph John Davila, who happened to release a record called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz that week, not only because of a reason to make money, but the way it was written was quite colorful, and he was obviously a creative person. The letter did not seem to fit a profile of a low-educated workman who most people thought the Axeman to be. On Wednesday, March 19th, St. Joseph's Day, the Times-Picayune printed an illustration depicting a family frantically playing jazz music from their piano with looks of sheer terror on their faces as they awaited for the Axeman to pass over the city. The article described all the jazzy festivals across the metropolitan area and the fact that the Axeman did not strike that evening. Mr. Davila would later use this very illustration as the cover of his now well-known published sheet music. He made a ton of money off that song, and he probably helped all the jazz musicians financially that year. A man named Joseph Bumfur is the only legitimate suspect to have ever been linked to the real identity of the Axeman. Bumfur led a blackmailing gang in New Orleans that targeted Italian Americans. In December 1920, a year after the Axeman had struck his last victim, Mike Pepitone, Bumfur himself was shot dead by the widow of Mr. Pepitone in Los Angeles. Mrs. Pepitone claimed Bumfur was the Axeman and remembered seeing him run from the bedroom the night her husband was killed. Bumfur had served time in prison, the dates apparently coinciding between 1912 and 1918 when the Axeman attacks stopped. They resumed at the same time Bumfur was a free man. He left New Orleans after the killing of Mike Pepitone, again, which could explain why the Axeman seemingly disappeared after 1919. He also went by many other names, and he was also in prison when most of the attacks occurred, However, recent research into the period has failed to find any evidence of a man named Joseph Bumfur being attacked and killed in New Orleans, leading some to believe that his existence is pure urban legend. In 1947, police arrested Jake Bird, a 45-year-old black transient who hopped trains across the country. He confessed that he murdered a couple in Tacoma, but New Orleans police singled him out for the axe murders of 1918. During questioning, Jake claimed responsibility for 44 murders across the country. Bird lived in New Orleans during axe murders of 1918. He was a young teenager at the time, so small enough to fit through door panels. Again, they are not taking into account that he reached through the panel to unlock the door. Anyway, since nothing else connected him to those crimes, police assumed Bird falsely confessed. A jury found him guilty of the killings in Tacoma and sentenced him to hang. Unfortunately, not to just hang out. Upon receiving his sentence, Bird predicted that every person in the courtroom would die before he did. And 6 of them did die before the state of Washington executed Bird on July 15th, 1949. Most criminologists agree that a serial killer, particularly one as vicious as the Axeman, cannot just decide to stop murdering one day. There needs to have been a reason why he was not able to stalk the streets anymore. So it is likely that the Axeman either died in 1919 or was sent to prison for an unrelated offense. There remains other questions about the Axeman. Why did he take so many breaks from his spree, particularly from 1911 until 1918? The breaks of a few weeks or months in between attacks are common for serial killers, who tend to lay low after 1 or 2 killings and then bask in the glory of what they have done before trying to find new victims who can give them their next rush. The long break in between 1911 and 1918 is less explainable, though some have suggested there was a physical reason he could not attack during this time. Maybe he was serving a prison sentence or working in a night job that kept him off the streets while people were sleeping. Such an explanation could account for the sudden explosion in activity in 1918. He may have been laid off early in the year and used his newfound spare time at night to launch what he saw as a revenge mission. But the Axeman was never seen or heard of again. Like the spirit he claimed to be, he simply vanished into thin air. Or did he? Evidence from police records and newspaper accounts show that he may have struck elsewhere in Louisiana, killing Joseph Sparrow and his daughter in Alexandria in December of 1920. Also, attacking Giovanni Orlando in DeRidder in January 1921, and Frank Scalisi in Lake Charles in April 1921. The killer's MO was the same, breaking into an Italian grocery in the middle of the night and attacking the grocer and his family with their own axe. Then the Axeman disappeared from history. Yet still, there are even more murders that Detective D'Antonio didn't attribute to the Axeman that sounded very likely to be and would throw off the 6 years missing in action whereabouts debate. It was on April 13th, 1910, when a man named Baraka and his 12-year-old son Joseph were already hard at work. The Barakas were farmers in St. Charles's Parish, and they grew sugarcane and vegetables on their 30 acres, and they had gone into the fields when it was still dark. The elder Baraka, his first name was either Anthony or Giovanni, depending on the source, was at the plow with his mule when a man with a bandana covering his face appeared from a wooded area. A shot rang out, followed by another, followed by another. 3 bullets from a rifle pierced the farmer's back and came out the other side. Baraka fell. The mule took off running. Joseph took off running too. The farmer was dead, but the killer had a message to send. According to a story in the next morning's Daily Picayune, the paper wrote, the attacker completed the ghastly deed by splitting the skull in two and removing the brains of his fallen foe. Another headline, Baraka fiendish vendetta victim, was a story linking the killing to a series of attacks believed by the press and police to be connected to organized crime. Feudist falls from shot from masked murderer close, while with little son plowing in his field. Joseph Baraka had seen the attack, but he couldn't identify the gunman. I saw the man when he came out of the woods, the boy told a sheriff's deputy, according to the Picayune. He wore a red handkerchief over his face and carried a gun. When he started, I ran home and told my mother that they had killed my pa. Anthony, or Giovanni, Baraka's family had been linked to a series of violent incidents in the past few years, including a shooting in 1908 that killed 3 men at what's now called the Beauregard Keys House, or something like that. 2 of Baraka's brothers were among the dead. They had supposedly been trying to extort Pietro Giacona, an affluent wine seller who lived at the home. Giacona had paid up on previous occasions, and on June 17th, his tormentors paid him a visit. He fed them and was liberal with the wine that night. But when the visitors demanded money again, a shootout erupted and the extortionists had not fared well. A year earlier, Baraka had been arrested in connection with the kidnapping and killing of a 7-year-old boy named Walter Lamanna, apparently a failed attempt to collect a ransom. Lamanna's mutilated body was found on June 23, 1907, near St. Rose, not far down the river from Baraka's farm. A man named Ignazio Campisciano, a neighbor of Baraka, confessed to killing Lamanna and was sent to Angola prison. The murder of Baraka was never attributed to the mysterious Axeman believed to be prowling the streets of New Orleans that decade, but it bore at least some resemblance to the Axeman attacks, mainly for its lack of a definitive motive and the weapon that transformed a callous murder into outright butchery. When Baraka was found, the arms were folded across the breast, wrote the Picayune, and on a piece of paper at its side were the brains of the murdered Italian. And of course, a headline reading, "A blood-covered axe told its silent, horrible story of the manner in which the skull was cleaved open." A search of digitized records turns up no evidence that Baraka's killer was caught, as with many of the slayings of the early 20th century in the New Orleans area that were believed to be connected to organized crimes. The killing of Giovanni Baraka, according to those cognizant with Italian vengeance lust, means that the whole feud will probably be opened again, warned the Item newspaper. So again, this is why most of the attacks were just connected to the vendetta, and none of it was reported. And another attack happened just before the 1918 murder of the Maggio couple. A grocery store owner named Epifanio Andolina was in bed with his wife and baby daughter in their building at 8301 Apple Street in the early morning of December 22, 1917. The family's teenage sons were in the next room, and in a bedroom at the front of the house were the Andolina's 5 daughters. Wow, I know what they did in their spare time. At around 3 a.m., as the family slept, a figure knocked upon a panel in a door at the rear of the building, somehow working quietly enough to avoid detection. That method of entry was replicated in several killings attributed to the mysterious Axeman, including the attack on the Maggios, the one that most people consider to be the first. The intruder crept through the kitchen and entered the bedroom where Epifanio and Annie Andolina and the baby lay. When Annie Andolina sat up in bed, the man stuck a gun in her face. In his other hand was a hatchet. Hush up, he told the woman. The man swung the hatchet at Epifanio Andolina, slicing him open on each side of the head. on top of the head and in the forehead. Then he moved on to the next room where the couple's sons were sleeping. After hitting my husband 4 or 5 times, the man turned and ran into the adjoining room, Annie Andolina told a reporter for the Item later that day. As he did so, I began to scream. At the same time, I heard my son scream, "Mama, Mama!" I ran into his room and found both John and Salvador out of bed crying. The hatchet man had passed back through my room to the kitchen and got away. Epifanio Andolina was rushed to Charity Hospital with head injuries. John Andolina, aged 14, had part of his scalp sliced off but was not seriously injured. Salvador, aged 13, had an arm bruised by a blow from the hatchet or the butt of the revolver. The girls and mother were untouched. A bloody hatchet found on a chair in the kitchen was taken as evidence. The father and his 2 boys survived the attack, but there were few clues. Nothing had been stolen, and the crime was never solved. By February 1918, the Andolinas had apparently had enough of New Orleans. Wanted to sell. A classified notice for their store and home in the Times-Picayune said, "First-class retail grocery store, dry, doing a good business, leaving city reasons for selling." I guess they did not want to say that an intruder got into their house and attacked them. But Andolina did not follow through on those plans, as he died in his home on October 23, 1918, of pneumonia, and he was a victim of the influenza pandemic sweeping across the globe. So the true identity of the killer, exactly who his victims were, and to the motives will forever remain one of crime's greatest unsolved mysteries. There are supposedly Axeman hauntings. The house where Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were murdered is said to be haunted by their remnants. On certain nights near the area, people have reported screams and shrieks. Also, the hospital where Joseph Romano was treated is said to be haunted by his restless spirit. Also, the haunted hotel, according to local legend, is aptly named Haunted Hotel of New Orleans and is a location believed to be where the Axeman hid between picking off his victims. This is the place where he slept during his murder sprees. The natives believe that his ghoulish specter remains at the hotel. In the back of the hotel, there is a quaint courtyard with a strange dark vibe. Visitors have claimed to have seen wandering shadows, pools of blood, capture strange EVPs, and even experience bizarre electrical hiccups with their cell phones. But what is left after Hurricane Ida? I don't know. Until next time, have a good evening. Oh, and don't leave any axes just laying around on your property for good measure.